Show you how this took place, and hopefully this will work.
Taslima and Hanan come from large families themselves, but they've decided to have just 2 children.
বাংলাদেশে এখন একটা স্লোগান আছে যেটা সবার ঘরে ঘরেই জানে যে দুটি সন্তানের বেশি নয়, একটি হলে ভালো হয়।
আমার ভাগ্য ভালো যে আমাদের 2টা সন্তান, অনেক সন্তান হইলে তো তাদের খরচা দিতে পারতাম। 2টা সন্তান যে মনের মতন তো তাদের যেটা চাওয়ার এটা পূরণ করতে পারতেছি।
তোমার আর কি?
আমার পকেট খালি হয়ে গেছে।
Taslima and Hanan are part of a cultural shift away from big families. And for Taslima, it's also become a job. She works for the government family planning service, which employs women like her in every village. She goes door to door to try to help others to have smaller families too.
মাসে গেছেন আজকে কতদিন? এইদিকে সমস্যা 22 তারিখে। তারপর আর কোনো পদ্ধতি নেন নাই? তাহলে সমস্যা হবে না? আমার বাচ্চা কোন সময় যাবে?
আমার তো মনে হয় না, হয়তো অনেক দেরিতে বাচ্চা এই যে বিয়ে।
তারপরও আপনি এখন তো 2টা বাচ্চা হয়ে গেছে।
আমি তো গেলাম না, এবারে সবার লেগে যায় না।
Taslima offers advice, moral support, and most importantly, a range of contraceptives.
এগুলো কন্ডম। আপনি তো 3টা মেয়ে, এখন আর বাচ্চা নেই।
Okay, so you get the idea there. So the point is that not only in Bangladesh, but in many countries, there's a large unmet need for family planning. And what this shows here, the data here, are the proportion of contraceptive demands that are satisfied for married women of childbearing age. And so you can see here that the inverse of that is going to be the proportion that's unsatisfied. So it's a large proportion in Africa, between 50 and 65%. In the Middle East and North Africa, about 25%, Eastern Europe, 20%, Asia, about 35%, Latin America, about 25%. So there's a large unmet need for family planning. I've experienced this myself. In my travel and work in Madagascar, I often came across rural families that wish that they could control family size, would find that their own lives could be more prosperous, that they could take care of the children that they had if they could have smaller families, but they had no means to do so. So it's interesting to look at population projections if contraceptive needs could be met. This is a kind of complicated graphic, but what you see here is first here with the red arrow is the typical business as usual scenario, leveling off at about 9 billion people. This is if fertility rates would very gradually decline from their current average just slightly, and mortality rates would also be declining. We'd level off at about 9 billion people. But what would happen if contraceptive needs could be met? This is an estimate looking at if just the 16% annual unwanted pregnancies could be avoided each year, then we would end up leveling off at actually about where we are right now, at about 7 billion. So we would have the same population as we do now. And this is a kind of a low measurement of the unmet need for family planning. That unmet need is probably greater than this, but this is one way of getting at that. It's also encouraging to realize that other countries, including other poor countries with relatively with low literacy rates like Bangladesh, could also reduce the total fertility rate. So in Iran, they managed to do it very, very quickly in only 5 years. And in Thailand also very quickly. And again, these were the kinds of programs that were similar in terms of lots of government support for meeting the unmet need for family planning. These are not coercive programs. So it's important to realize that population is a variable, not a given, and that it is possible to imagine smaller total populations in the future. So going to the second point about changing consumption patterns. So right now, we produce all of these crops, and about 55% of that is directly for human food, but a huge amount, 36%, goes to feed livestock, not people. And then a smaller but still significant chunk is for our crops that are being used for biofuels. And the issue here is that there's such an incredible, so incredibly inefficient to produce crops that are then fed to livestock that we then eat because of the conversion inefficiencies. The caloric conversion efficiency for dairy is about 40%. For beef, it's only about 3%. And so across the board, if you think about the distribution of these products that we're making, the amounts of these products that we're making, this 36%, there's a loss of about 90% of those calories by the time it gets to people, actually. And you can think of that as a form of wastage. So that 36% becomes only 4% of calories that are delivered to people, along with the 55% that is directly consumed of all the crops that are being produced. And we can look at this on a map as well and see that here in the United States, this scaling shows the calories delivered to the food system per calorie produced. And so what it's showing is that here in the United States, we produce an enormous amount of calories through all the grains that we produce, but very little of it is actually delivered to people. It's being delivered to livestock, and that conversion efficiency is so low. In contrast, in a place like Africa, it's not nearly as productive, not producing nearly as much, but a lot more of what it's producing is actually going directly to people. So if we were to shift just half of the crops used for livestock feed and biofuels to direct food production, that would provide sufficient calories for 2 billion more people. And then our problem of the hungry, food insecure people would actually vanish. Of course, and this would greatly reduce the stress on the system. We wouldn't be essentially producing all this food that ends up getting wasted. It would also have other benefits in terms of shifting to healthier diets, since eating lots of meat is not healthy. It shifts to healthier diets across the income spectrum because, of course, many people are not getting the calories that they need or the protein that they need, and making these available would certainly help with that. But again, this is sort of the big brother perspective. This is the feeding the world perspective. We can't just magically change these things and shift half of the crops that are currently going from for livestock feed and biofuels to directly feed people. It doesn't work that way. So I'll come back to that later. And then the third the third way that we could change, have an alternative future in terms of how much food we need to produce, is to think about food waste. There's so much food is being wasted, 30 to 40%. And this varies greatly by region. The causes of food waste vary. So in the developing countries, you can see that a lot of the food waste is in the step of the production step, production to retailing. And so what's going on here is that there's the lack of facilities, of infrastructure for getting products to market or for storing products. So a lot of stuff gets wasted at the front end, in the field itself or on the way to market. But in developed countries, we have food waste that's happening at that stage, but also very much at the consumer stage as well. And there's a lot of different reasons for this. Some of the food waste that we have at the production stage might be because products are deemed unsuitable for some reason, even for a cosmetic reason, or due to just simply sort of inefficient arrangements between farmers and buyers, so that food gets wasted on the field. But there are also issues of labeling. So we end up wasting a lot of food because of confusing food labels that don't necessarily differentiate between when you're supposed to sell the food by versus when the food is freshest versus when it's actually not safe to eat. And so a lot of people will use expiration labels and throw food out when it is actually perfectly good. And of course, we also have the supersizing phenomenon, which can lead to a lot of food wastage in our fridges. Eliminating half of the food wastage just from the crops eaten directly by people could provide sufficient calories for nearly 1 billion people. So this food waste issue is really huge. If we could just get that under control, that would certainly help to reduce stress on the system and provide more food for those who need it. So what sort of actions do we need to take to alter these key variables so that we don't need to double food production in the future? So for population, it seems clear that empowering women's choice of people's choice, men's choice as well, of smaller family size, and most importantly, providing access to contraception and to information about contraception to meet the unmet need for family planning could greatly reduce population growth in the future and keep us at a more manageable and sustainable level. And here we have real examples of how this has already happened. Strongly supporting that this happens throughout the places where it's needed is really important. On diet, we need policies, education, and outreach to reduce meat consumption in the high meat consuming countries and economic sectors of countries. But at the same time, we also really need to think about people that currently don't have access to enough meat and the critical micronutrients it supplies. So promoting mixed crop livestock farming systems to increase access to meat in low meat consuming regions and economic sectors is also important. And for food waste, we need policies, education, outreach, and infrastructure, depending on the country, to help reduce it. Because if we can break these trends locally, nationally, and globally, then we don't need to double world food production. We need to continue producing, maybe not as much food as we do already, but we need to continue producing food and getting it out to people. So that's, I think, where our real challenges are. We need to deal not just with the future problems of a larger population and a population that's consuming differently, but we need to put in place a system for feeding the people that we already have on the planet while we're working to break these trends.